Hey, my name's Alex. I'm 29, just an average guy working in sales and traveling more often than I'd like. I've had my fair share of weird moments on the road, but 2 years ago I went through something that changed everything. Since that night, I can't seem to shake his face from my mind, or the sound of his twisted laughter echoing in the silence. Maybe sharing this will help, or at least make someone think twice about a late-night detour off I-10. As I merged onto I-10 late that night, I was exhausted. The trip back to Los Angeles from Phoenix had been long, a string of meetings and client calls, and my head pounded with each mile. Outside my windows, the vast desert stretched out in all directions, dark and endless, the sky above freckled with stars. I was the only car on this stretch of highway, the only pulse of life in a sea of shadows. The drone of the engine and the steady hum of the asphalt beneath me were lulling me into a dangerous drowsiness. My eyes flicked to the fuel gauge. It hovered near empty. I checked the GPS. The nearest gas station was only a couple of miles away, a lonely chevron off the road. Perfect, I thought. Coffee, a quick refill, and I'd be back on the road in no time. The station loomed into view, its neon chevron sign casting an eerie green glow over the forecourt. The lights flickered occasionally, but that was typical for these isolated spots. The station was empty, of course. No other cars, no other people, just a single structure under the empty desert sky. I pulled up to one of the pumps and turned off the engine. The silence was immediate, pressing, as though the desert had swallowed all sound. I climbed out, stretched, and grabbed the gas pump. The air was thick and oddly still, save for a faint rustle of wind. As I started fueling, I noticed another car, a grimy black SUV with tinted windows, pull slowly into the station. It crept in, rolling to a stop on the opposite side of the pump island. I watched it, curious but trying not to stare. Its engine continued to rumble, idling, but no one stepped out. I felt an uneasy chill crawl up my spine. It was late, and there were no lights except those from the station and my headlights. I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus on the pump, counting down the gallons. It was probably just another driver needing gas, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Once the tank was full, I stepped toward the station's small convenience store to grab some coffee and pay. The door dinged as I walked in, but the place was silent. Behind the counter, the chair was empty, and no one was in sight. I called out a tentative, "Hello?" but only silence greeted me. The coffee machine sat in the corner, hissing quietly. I filled a cup, my eyes darting to the door. Through the window, I could see the SUV still idling outside, the windows a solid wall of black. I quickly paid at the counter, leaving cash on top, hoping the attendant would find it. I didn't want to linger any longer than necessary. As I stepped out, my stomach twisted. There, standing just a few feet from my car, was a tall, bearded man in faded clothes. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, a twisted smile tugging at his lips. My voice caught in my throat, but I managed a quick, can I help you?" The man tilted his head slightly, and that twisted smile widened. "You look a little lost, friend. Mind if I show you something?" His voice was low and mocking, a thinly veiled threat that turned my skin cold. I glanced past him toward my car, hoping he'd move aside. He didn't. His gaze held me, and then, slowly, he lifted his right hand. In it, he held a gun, pointed casually but unmistakably in my direction. "Let's take a little walk, shall we?" he drawled, jerking his head toward the desert stretching out beyond the gas station. Fear clawed up my throat, but I nodded, keeping my movements slow. Any sudden reaction could trigger something far worse. I kept my hands up, palms open, my mind racing for a way out. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, and at the mercy of a stranger with a gun. We walked in silence, the distance between the station and the edge of the desert shrinking with each step. My breathing grew shallow as he led me further from the lights, my eyes darting to the blackness that lay ahead. I had to stall, to buy myself time. "Look, man," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't have much, but I'll give you everything, cash, phone, whatever you want, just please, let's not do this." The man stopped, his smirk deepening. "Go on then," he said, his voice a quiet sneer. "Empty your pockets. All of it, nice and slow." I fumbled in my pockets, pulling out my wallet, phone, and keys, and dropped them onto the sand in front of me. The man's eyes flickered down, his lips twisting into that cruel smile once more. "Kneel," he commanded, his voice chillingly calm. I hesitated, fear freezing my limbs, but the cold pressure of the gun in his hand forced my compliance. I dropped to my knees, hands raised behind my head, every muscle tense, waiting. My mind was racing, heart hammering against my ribs as I stared at the sand beneath me, waiting for whatever came next. Then, in the silence of the night, the sharp, deafening crack of a gunshot split the air. I flinched, eyes clenching shut, bracing for the inevitable pain, but nothing came. I forced my eyes open, barely breathing. The man was standing a few feet away, his gun raised, a manic gleam in his eyes. He fired again, deliberately missing, each shot landing closer to me in the sand. A sickening laugh broke the silence. It was him. He was laughing. He had been toying with me, playing out his sick joke. I watched, frozen in horror, as he finally lowered the gun, his laughter fading as he looked at me one last time, disgust etched into his face. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the gas station, vanishing into the darkness. I stayed on my knees, numb, too shocked to move. Minutes passed before I dared lift my head, scanning the area to make sure he was gone. My legs shook as I stumbled to my feet and staggered back to the gas station, every nerve on edge. I reached my car, finding the door open and the interior rifled through. He had taken everything, even the bag with my clothes from the trip. I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back. I collapsed into the driver's seat, fumbling with the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I threw the car into drive, leaving that haunted station and its cruel visitor far behind me. But the feeling of dread remained, clinging to me like the memory of his twisted laugh. The drive back to Los Angeles was a blur. Every pair of headlights that appeared behind me sent a new jolt of fear through my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. When I finally reached home, the silence felt different, heavier. The familiar rooms felt foreign, haunted by the shadows of that night in the desert. No one knew what I'd been through, and even if they did, they wouldn't understand. I wasn't the same. His face, his laughter, they were burned into my mind. I knew the fear he'd planted would follow me for the rest of my life. And I knew, too, that next time, I might not be so lucky. When I was a junior in high school, I took a part-time job working at a local gas station on the outskirts of town. It was one of those old, standalone stations surrounded by empty fields and dense woods, the kind of place where customers were sparse after dark. I took the job mostly because it was quiet, and I could get my schoolwork done during the long, uneventful shifts. One night, I was scheduled to work the late shift from 6 p.m. to midnight. The evening started like any other, sporadic customers coming in to fill up their tanks or grab a quick snack. By 9 p.m., the flow of cars had slowed to a trickle, and I was left alone in the dimly lit station, the fluorescent lights flickering above me. I busied myself with restocking shelves and cleaning up behind the counter. Around 10:30, as I was taking out the trash to the dumpster behind the building, I noticed a car slowly pulling into the lot. It was an old beat-up sedan with tinted windows. The driver didn't get out immediately, which struck me as odd. Instead, the car idled there for a few minutes, the engine rumbling softly in the otherwise silent night. I stood frozen by the dumpster, a strange sense of unease washing over me. Eventually, the driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a hooded jacket that obscured most of his face. He glanced around the empty lot before finally walking toward the entrance. I hurried back inside, locking the side door behind me. The man entered the station and slowly browsed the aisles, seemingly in no rush. Every now and then, I caught him glancing up at me from under his hood, his eyes dark and unblinking. After what felt like an eternity, he came to the counter with a single pack of gum. He placed it down and just stood there, staring at me. I rang him up, trying to act casual, but my hands were trembling. As I handed him his change, he leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper as he said, "You're all alone out here, aren't you?" The question sent chills down my spine. I forced a smile and nodded, hoping he would just leave. But instead of walking out, he took a step back, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He slid it across the counter to me. Confused, I unfolded it, revealing a handwritten note that simply read, "Go to the back room now, don't ask questions." My heart pounded in my chest. I glanced up, but the man was already walking toward the exit. He turned and gave me one last look before disappearing into the darkness outside. I didn't know what to do. The station was dead silent, with only the hum of the refrigerators filling the air. Against my better judgment, I walked to the back room where we kept extra supplies and the office. As I stepped in, the lights suddenly flickered and went out. I stood there in pitch black, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. Just as I was about to turn around, I heard a faint tapping sound, like something was hitting the window from outside. I didn't waste any more time. I bolted out of the room, grabbed my phone, and called the police. They arrived surprisingly fast, and after a thorough search, they found no sign of the man or any other suspicious activity. But what they did find, hidden behind the station, was a small makeshift camp with ropes, duct tape, and other unsettling items. It was clear that someone had been planning something, but they never caught the guy. I quit the job the next day, unable to shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something terrible. The police never found out who the man was or what he had planned, but I'll never forget the way he looked at me, like I was prey. The night shift had sounded easy enough. Just sit behind the counter at the gas station and let time pass until morning. That's what I thought when I got the job at Wilson's Gas and Go. The manager, Tom, handed me the keys, along with a list of things to do when business was slow. "Piece of cake," he'd said. "Only get a couple customers each night. And some of them are different. Just smile, be polite, and don't ask questions." He gave me a smile that was supposed to be reassuring, but something in his eyes looked off. I brushed it off as part of the whole first day jitters thing. I was wrong. It was quiet at first, just the occasional hum of the fluorescent lights and the low rumble of trucks passing on the highway in the distance. Midnight came and went. By 1 a.m, I'd done all the tasks Tom listed, so I just stood behind the counter trying to keep my eyes open. Then the bell above the door chimed. I looked up, surprised to see anyone here at this hour. A man shuffled in, his clothes worn and dusty, the kind that looked like they belonged in an old photograph. His hair was slicked back, and he had a strange stiffness to his movements. He didn't look at me as he walked to the back of the store, where the drinks were kept. I waited, tapping my fingers on the counter, watching as he finally shuffled back with a bottle of root beer. When he placed it on the counter, I noticed something strange about his hands. His skin looked paper-thin, almost translucent. He didn't say a word, just stared as I rang up the bottle. "That'll be $1.50, I said, trying to sound casual. He pulled out a few coins and dropped them onto the counter with a soft clink. I stared down at them. A handful of old silver coins, the kind that looked like they came out of a collector's book. I frowned, picking one up and turning it over. They were old. Too old. I glanced up, ready to ask him if he had something more current, but he was already gone. The bell hadn't rung and the door hadn't opened, but he was gone. I shook it off. This was Nevada. People here had quirks. It didn't mean anything. Then, around 2:15, the phone rang. I jumped, heart racing. The phone on the counter was ancient, one of those rotary phones that didn't belong in this decade. I hesitated, then picked it up, forcing a calm voice. "Wilson's Gas and Go. Can I help you?" Silence. "Hello?" I tried again. There was something on the other end, a faint crackling sound like a distant whisper. I strained to hear it, my heart thudding in my chest. Then, just as I thought I heard something, the line went dead. I set the phone down slowly, feeling a chill run down my spine. Another hour crawled by. Just when I thought I'd imagined the whole thing, the door chimed again. A woman stepped in, her face pale under the dim lights, her hair pinned up in tight curls that looked straight out of a 50s movie. She wore a dress that shimmered in a way I hadn't seen before. Her eyes locked onto me as she approached the counter, each step slow and deliberate. "Can I help you?" I managed to say, my voice sounding weaker than I'd hoped. She didn't answer, just stared at me with an unnervingly blank expression. Then she raised her hand, placing something on the counter, a small leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked and worn, like it had been held by 1,000 hands. I reached out to touch it, but she snapped her hand over mine, icy cold and strong. "Don't read it," she whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. I nodded, pulling my hand back, and she slid the notebook across the counter, her eyes never leaving mine. Just as suddenly as she'd come in, she turned and walked out. The door didn't chime and she didn't open it. The clock read 3:33. The quiet settled over the store again, heavier now, like something was pressing down on the room, making the air feel thick. I stared at the notebook, the words, "Don't read it," echoing in my head. Curiosity got the better of me. I cracked it open just to peek. The pages were filled with lists, written in old-fashioned script, names and dates. Some were crossed out, others circled. And then I saw it. My own name scrawled in faded ink next to tonight's date. A sudden sound made me jump. The lights flickered. The phone rang again, louder this time, as if it were right next to my ear. I picked it up with a trembling hand. "Wilson's Gas and Go," I whispered. Silence, then a low voice, barely audible. "Get out." I froze, my hand shaking, the line crackling before it went dead again. I dropped the phone, stepping back from the counter, my pulse racing. The door creaked open, and I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, making their way towards me. My eyes darted around the store, looking for some sign of life, but I was alone. Outside, the empty gas station loomed dark and deserted, the pumps like silent sentinels watching me. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could almost feel them behind me. I turned, ready to bolt, but no one was there, just empty aisles and that damn flickering light overhead. The phone rang again, and this time, I didn't answer it. I backed up towards the door, fumbling for the keys, every instinct telling me to run. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him, the first man, the one with the old coins, standing just outside the glass, his face pressed against it, watching me. His eyes glowed in the dim light, and his lips twisted into a grin that sent a cold wave of dread through me. I threw the door open and ran to my car, not looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles down the highway, my heart racing, my hands shaking on the wheel. I've never gone back to Wilson's Gas and Go, and I never will.